All right, welcome in, everybody. A little Dirt and Sprague overtime here on the 1080 The Fan YouTube page. Excited to talk to a good friend of the show, a man who we've had on many times over the years, Kevin Pelton, NBA writer for ESPN. He's got some good stuff up on the NBA playoffs on ESPN.com that you can go check out, at K Pelton on Twitter. Kevin, first off, thanks for doing this, man. I do want to get to the NBA playoffs with you because those teams are probably deserving of being talked about, unlike our Portland Trailblazers, who have had a rough couple of years here. I do want to start there just because I'm curious from your perspective. We talk about it day in and day out, and the fans are always, it's all over the map, right? Some people buy in and believe in the direction. Some people are done. Some people won't go again until Jody Allen sells. When you look at just the direction they're going and where they're at, how does Kevin Pelton feel about the state of the Blazers?
I think it's understandable where they are and where they've been the last couple of seasons. And I know people want to lay this at the feet of Jody Allen and Joe Cronin because they're the people who, I wouldn't necessarily say Jody Allen is out front and center because she never talks to the media, but they're the faces of this. But this is what happens in the NBA. You went all in after the 2019 conference finals run on a team that frankly wasn't good enough to do that again, unfortunately. And now you're paying the toll for that. It comes time to rebuild. I mean, I think, the one concern I'd say I have about the Blazers from a big picture standpoint is a couple years in, we still haven't identified who that centerpiece of a rebuild of the next great Blazers team is going to be. Obviously, the hope is still that it's Scoot Henderson and that development that he showed late in the regular season can translate into that. But the answer realistically might be someone that you draft in 2025, and that's probably going to inform what goes on for the Blazers the next couple of years more than anything else.
Kevin, I reading some of your playoff preview pieces and some of the ones that have been updated to the teams that are remaining, that strikes me. I'm watching Minnesota last night, and obviously Ant's awesome, Cat's awesome. They've got role guys that have emerged for a lot of people that didn't follow the regular season. All of these teams have found pieces. And I'm curious, clearly going for young potential talent that can be an Ant Edwards is the goal. But how valuable is it in your estimation when team building to try to be better, finding those pieces that don't necessarily get the spotlight along the way that kind of makes sense? So when you find one, you've got some reliable things around them that can help them grow quicker.
Yeah, I think Dallas is an interesting example of that, where they did have some of those guys when they first drafted Luka Doncic and were able to get back into the playoffs his second season. And then lost a number of those guys, Jalen Brunson most notably, who's turned out to be a lot more than just a supporting role player now that he's with the New York Knicks. But, then they had to kind of rebuild that, and it cost them a lot of first-round draft picks to do it in terms of adding Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington Jr. And then the Kyrie trade, obviously, is a more significant player than that. So the ideal, I think, is you want to be in a situation where you can do it without having to kind of sacrifice your future in that way. And that's what you see with Oklahoma City is obviously, I wrote about this last week, why they're uniquely well positioned, that they have the star in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. They have a couple of other guys who are rising stars in Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams. And they still have all their own draft picks and all these extra draft picks and swaps. And that's maybe the depressing thing if you're a fan of, a team elsewhere in the Western Conference is you look at Oklahoma City, you look at San Antonio with Victor Wembanyama, it's going to be tough to get on their level, but that's kind of the model, and I think what you're looking for. And one of the other things I would say about the emergence of a star, and this goes back to my first answer, is all of a sudden it puts those other guys in a position to look so much better. If Anthony Edwards isn't there, making everything go, Jaden McDaniels, all of a sudden, maybe you're more concerned about the fact that, he's not a terrific individual shot creator. He's has become a really low usage player in the NBA. And, so you think about guys on the Blazers roster like Toumani Camara and Matisse Thybulle, I don't think they're probably quite to the level of Jaden McDaniels, but I think, Thybulle has been at a similar level defensively, probably not as a shooter. And when they're supplementing younger players who are still growing and trying to figure things out, they don't look as good. Their weaknesses are magnified. When you put them next to a star who can put them in a more proper role, all of a sudden they look a lot better.
I love that answer too. And getting back to your point about Scoot and finding out who is the guy that you're going to build around, I think that's the hardest part that I'm having right now as a fan of just looking at them of I think that dictates all the other moves that you want to make. Who's our focal point and how do we want to build around him? And I look at the roster, and I think Scoot was really encouraging at the end of the year. He was the number 3 pick. He was the guy that was such a good asset that you didn't want to go get Damian Lillard help for. And I have a hard time squaring him and Anthony Simons on the same roster. Like, Scoot, in my opinion, he has to have the ball in his hands to be the most effective. He's not a great off the ball guy. Ant's kind of the same way. What's your read on that? And do you get the sense that maybe Anthony Simons' days are numbered in Portland because of that issue?
I do think Anthony Simons can be effective in an off-ball role. I mean, obviously we saw it with Dame, and I think he's going to be most valuable when he's kind of toggling between the two, which is why Orlando is a team that's been talked about so much, where he could provide some of that shot creation that they've asked so much of Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner without a traditional point guard the last couple of years, but also be effective off the ball because you're going to want the ball in those guys' hands. So I don't think that necessarily forces the issue. I think it's maybe more of just the timeline. And you did hear Ant talk about at the exit interviews about, like, I'm ready to start winning. And, understandably so, given his age. He's on a different timeline than some of these other guys, Jeremy Grant even perhaps more so. I think that maybe forces the issue, and just being able to try to get value for these players while they've got multiple years left on their contracts.
Hey, Kevin, I don't know if this is kind of two separate maybe things for you. Team building is important, and I think kind of getting an idea of the team concept that the Portland Trailblazers are aiming for, right? You mentioned these great Western Conference teams. Do you feel like they have shown you, somebody who's pretty, in the know on all this stuff, where they're going with the team building? Because it's interesting listening to Joe. He's had 2 different press conferences where he's kind of said, figuring out what our identity is. And I'm like, this is year 3 of Chauncey. I feel like that's, whether you have the right pieces or not, I feel like that's what you should know, but it doesn't seem like they do. Do you feel like by their team building decisions so far early that what they're trying to kind of piece together here?
I mean, I think we definitely can say that they have some archetypes that they like the length on the wing and on the perimeter has certainly been a big focal point, especially when you look at kind of the later picks, the Ryan Repairs of the world. So I think there's those kind of archetypes. I don't think there is a specific identity, but I'm generally kind of the philosophy that being good creates your identity rather than having an identity makes you good. And I think so much of that is driven by your best player. Like, Minnesota has taken shape, but they only took shape after Anthony Edwards was in place. And it's like, how are we going to put these other guys around him and build out using him? And I mean, Chris Finch certainly deserves credit for that. And, it's a totally different Timberwolves front office than when he was first drafted and came into the league, and some of these players were acquired. But I think that, again, goes back to, you got to know who the guy is and then build around that player's skills.
Looking in hindsight, easy to do, but the trade of Damian Lillard was very controversial, and fans were very split about it. He had an up and down year in Milwaukee, and seeing Miami lose, I think, and some of the comments from Pat Riley has brought into the forefront of the negotiations that happened. And one of the unique cases in the NBA where a player didn't get the demand and destination that he wanted. Looking back in hindsight, how do you feel that Joe Cronin handled that? And obviously we don't know what it fully will turn into with some of the Brogdon and Williams pieces that likely will eventually get moved. But how do you feel about the way Cronin handled that? And now maybe a season later or a summer later, feel about the return that Portland got?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 things that have happened in the last year that have really changed the perspective on that. One of those is Jaime Jaquez Jr. being as good as he was in Miami. And, that doesn't necessarily mean it would have translated into a very different situation in Portland. And also, I think a lot of the appeal of Jaime Jaquez Jr. that really is so important for the Heat, and why, some of the teams, notably the Lakers, that drafted ahead of him have to be kind of kicking themselves, is this is somebody who's ready to really contribute as a role player right away. Doesn't do as much for the Blazers as it does for Miami, but certainly I think there were a lot of Blazers fans that poo-pooed the players that would potentially be coming back in that Miami offer. And Jaquez has dramatically exceeded expectations. Nikola Jovic had a nice second season. They look like they're going to be rotation players, certainly. But the other thing that's happened is, like, Milwaukee's future seems very much in flux, given the age of that roster, given another first-round loss. Giannis Antetokounmpo did sign an extension, but I'm feeling very good about being short on the Milwaukee Bucks and, holding their first-round picks going forward. So I think those are going to end up being the most important pieces, obviously, of this trade. Brogdon and Williams. Brogdon will potentially return something, I think, this summer that'll be useful. But when you look at like what's really going to make this a home run trade, it's Milwaukee bottoming out and not having control of its own lottery picks during that stretch because you've got them all.
I hate to, I noticed that banner in the background there, the Seattle Supersonics. And I know a lot of people have talked about Seattle, Vegas, potentially maybe it's the two new expansion teams if the NBA gets that in a couple of years once they get the TV deal done. The obvious reason you expand, well, is not just money. There's a lot of people that believe the talent pool is deep enough to have two new teams in. Is this kind of, I think for franchises like Portland in this position where they're trying to find their Anthony Edwards, their Luka Doncic, is this also kind of an underrated part or in time for franchises like that to find diamond in the roughs, to find these players, given the talent pool seems like it's talented enough now, but we might still be 2 years, away from expansion actually happening. That only happens when the talent is deep enough. Do you feel like that's kind of it's an underrated part of rebuilding, is finding the right pieces as we go along, because we have so many available pieces, given that two new franchises will exist?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. And I think, from the talent pool standpoint, one of the things that I've written about is, people kind of fetishize the talent in the NBA in the 80s and 90s. And you think about it, at that point, particularly in the 80s and the very early 90s, it's almost all American players. And now, the top 4 finishers, I think, in MVP will likely all be international players. Probably, Jalen Brunson or Jason Tatum or whoever finishes 5th will be the top American player, not counting Joel Embiid. You had win it last year. I guess he is now American since he's on the national team, but
right.
He's not someone who would have played in the NBA in the 1980s. And then, the depth of talent in France. We talked about Repair, 3, maybe 4 first-round picks in this year's first round after producing the generational prospect in Wembanyama, the talent from Canada. Like, this talent pool is so much more massive than it was in the 90s. And since 1995, you've added 1 franchise. So I do think the talent pool is overwhelmingly deep to support expansion. I mean, I think it's also just kind of from a mathematical standpoint. Like, if you add 2 expansion teams, whether it's 2027 or 2026 or whenever that is, like, they're not going to be very good. That's going to be more teams you're competing with for lottery positioning, ping pong balls at that time. So yeah, you probably do want to have your difference maker in place before that happens. Now, the one downside to expansion is if you have a deep enough roster, some of those guys might become very attractive in an expansion draft, but it's a little far out, I think, to be planning for that.
Interesting. I don't know how closely you follow it, Kevin, because I know you do a lot on the NBA and WNBA. Are you hearing anything about this draft class that is encouraging? I mean, we're all waiting around for Sunday night to see where the lottery balls are going to land. And I'm sure we've joked that, of course, we missed the Wembanyama one by 1 ping pong ball. So this will be the year we get the number 1 overall pick in Portland. I'm just curious if you're hearing anything and your thoughts, if you have any, on this year's draft class.
I think it's a little underrated, I would say. I think just kind of these things tend to snowball in terms of everyone's, piling on each other to talk about how bad these prospects are. I see why people feel the way they do, because there's not, to me, one obvious prospect who like checks every single boxes. I do statistical projections, and it's interesting because, you look at the top guys, there's, particularly among the college players, there's a couple of traditional centers who you wonder, can they be valuable enough to justify, a top 5 pick in Donovan Clingan and then Zach Edey, who were just so dominant at the college level, but the NBA game is very different in terms of what you ask of your big man. And then the other guy who really pops in the statistical projections, someone who probably doesn't fit for Portland because of their depth in the backcourt, but Reed Shepherd from Kentucky, who's also kind of an unorthodox prospect where he wasn't even considered a likely one and done coming into this season, but his steal rate, his 50% 3-point shooting, he like lights up every single analytics model, I think.
Of course, it's a guard in the year.
Yeah. The wings.
Yeah, the wing. Remember, that's what we need. Now we got to get another guard. We'll just add another one to the bunch, man.
Kevin, what were your takeaways? I got a Chauncey question, but I'm also curious, just in kind of following the Scoot journey, the expectations, I think, go a little through the roof because he's the number 3 pick, and they're like, hey, any other draft, he's probably number 1. And so that kind of sets this narrative of expectation, what were your general takeaways year one, Scoot Henderson, from where he was to where he kind of ended, and how you feel about maybe year two and kind of looking forward, projecting out a little bit?
Yeah, I would say I was probably a little lower on Scoot in the draft than most. I mentioned those statistical projections. He, did not fare as well as Brandon Miller, who, I think it was a surprise to people, or they interpreted it as primarily about the fit with LaMelo Ball, Charlotte taking him number 2. I had him number 2 on my board as well. At some point, I think, even though his production in the G League wasn't what you'd hoped it would be for a top prospect, you sort of defer to the scouts who were so enamored of his game. And, so I was very excited about him as well, but I think the expectations for him as a rookie needed to be particularly tempered, because there's a long track record of teenage point guards coming into the NBA and struggling, even ones who have become very good. I think sometimes it can be a little overstated. Like, it's still like, you want to be good as a rookie. That's a better indicator, than not being good, even though guys like Darius Garland, De'Aaron Fox, I don't think was quite as ineffective as some people have made him out to be as a rookie, but you wouldn't have projected him to be the kind of all-star, potentially all NBA level contributor that he's become based on his rookie season. So there's a lot of potential for growth. And I do think the things that we saw from him late in the season, like, you have to be wary of the final month of the regular season because of the way that the level of competition thins out around the league. But from a process standpoint, he was doing the right things and showing progress in the places he needed to. And I think we'll learn so much more about him in year 2, because there are not as many examples of guys who really struggled at point guard 2 years into their career and then went on to have that kind of all-star ceiling.
Makes it a barometer year. Well, we've been used to watching a lot of bad basketball around here the last couple of years, and then I turn on Minnesota Denver last night, and I'm like, oh, that's what championship level defense and basketball and length and athleticism looks like. I took a flyer on Minnesota just because I thought, what the hell? They got length. I love Anthony Edwards. I didn't even think they'd be up 2-0. I figured Denver was going to bounce back with a good performance. What do you make of it? I know you came out with the tiers of the playoff teams that are left. Is Minnesota now number 1? Like, how do we rank this? What do you make of what's going on?
Yeah, I guess we'll see what we see from Boston tonight. It's tough because they just aren't being challenged in the Eastern Conference the way that these top teams in the West are. And, Minnesota, this is something I was wondering last night. If there's ever been a team that was an underdog going into their first round series that won the championship, I guess probably, who it is, funny enough, would probably be the 2011 Mavericks, who played against the Blazers in the first round, that had that last Brandon Roy hurrah in that eventual 6-game series. Mm-hmm. I think Portland might have been favored in that one. I remember I picked them for sure. Yeah, I mean, Minnesota has been like by far the most impressive team so far in the playoffs, and winning game 1 on the road was one thing. Winning game 2, given the recent track record where until last year's Eastern Conference Finals, where Miami went up 3-0 on Boston in that series, we hadn't seen the home team lose the first 2 games of the series in a really long period of time. It was 16 consecutive home wins before that Miami win in Boston, and they were, typically blowouts, an average of 17 points per game in that span. And to go in there and, overcome that without Rudy Gobert and the kind of production that they got from Naz Reid and the kind of defense that they were playing without the presumptive defensive player of the year, I mean, it was a remarkable performance. I mean, I don't want to count out Denver. You look at the list of series where teams have gone down 2-0 at home and come back to win. Probably the most famous of those was the 1995 Houston Rockets over Phoenix in round 2. And that's the Rudy Tomjanovich, never underestimate the heart of a champion series. So, but Denver is in a position we didn't see them at all last year. They didn't play a team this good. They never trailed in a series. Now all of a sudden you're down 2-0 and have to win 4 out of 5. It's going to be a remarkable test. And no one looks good when they're going down 2-0 in that fashion, but they really look physically and offensively broken.
Yeah, Kevin, I like that we're weaving kind of in and out of NBA and Blazer stuff. So I guess I'll zig back into the Blazer thing. I want to ask you, because you're so analytically driven, the way you kind of follow the game and you write it out. This is one of those dumb cliche barbershop type of things that I'm going to throw at you, but you've been following and watching basketball your whole life. When you watch a certain player, I don't know if you can put an analytic on it, but when you watch Ant Edwards, you can kind of just see that kind of alpha, number 1, I'm leading the pack stuff, right? That the thing everybody talks about with MJ and Kobe and Bron and whatnot. It's Shaedon Sharpe had an unfortunate season because he only got to play like 31 games. The one thing I worry about is if he has that kind of motor. Does he have this thing? And I don't know if I can answer yes on that. I certainly kind of lean more no than yes. When do you think you start to see some of that stuff emerge from some of the younger players? Because I felt like you could kind of see some of it, even though it was a little inconsistent from Anthony Edwards. Now, this is another level at 22, but when do you think you start to kind of feel like you're seeing some of that stuff from guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think he delivered an indication of this probably 2 years ago in that first round series against Memphis when he was guarding John Morant for a lot of that series. And for a playoff debutant, like didn't look rattled at all by the moment. It never looked too big for him as it has continued to not look too big. So, I think that was his second season in the league when he managed to do it. And obviously that's a different opportunity because he got drafted to a team that, already had an all-star in Karl Anthony Towns and had some other pieces in place and was able to be successful more quickly. I mean, Shaedon, kind of the opportunity we've seen it, was the last month of his rookie season when he was the guy and the ball was in his hands and he was making a lot happen. And again, that was the same thing where they were wildly outmatched talent-wise, possibly trying to lose games. So it's harder to take as much away from that as it is from a playoff series. But I do think it's a bummer, as you said, that we just didn't get to see him last year and, gauge his development beyond the first couple months of the season, some of which he was clearly laboring through this injury that eventually shut him down. And to go way back to the question about, Scoot and Anthony Simons fitting together, I mean, I think Shaedon is maybe the real wild card and the real issue there where, like, could you play Scoot and Anthony Simons together and have those guys both be effective? Yeah. Can you play all three of those guys together on the perimeter and not be at a size disadvantage on a nightly basis and, not be taking the, having to constantly be like your turn, my turn with all three of those guys? Now that's where it becomes, I think, more of an issue. So Shaedon's development is maybe more than Scoot Henderson's could force the issue with Simons.
Interesting. You're telling me 3-guard lineups don't work. We're going to just keep trying them. Eventually, we're going to find a combo in Portland of 3 guards that's going to land us an NBA championship. NBA playoffs are going on. WNBA is tipping off here soon. Anything you want to send people to or alert people on that you're working on right now that you got cooking up?
Yeah, we got our top 25 players in the WNBA that I annually do with Michael Vopel and Alexa Phillip, who are primary women's basketball writers. So that's coming out on Thursday that we just hashed out the list and had some fun figuring out who ranks where.
It felt good for women's basketball to get to the place of debating the GOAT. That was like that. That's when you've made it. Everybody's arguing Caitlin Clark. Is she a GOAT? She's not a GOAT. She didn't win a championship. Felt good. The sport's made it.
Yeah, and specifically overreacting to what's happened recently and not considering the history. Like that is a marker.
Kevin, do you think Portland gets a team? We felt like we were going to get one and then we lost it. So like I'm kind of left in the air. Like my kid's asking, "Hey, are we going to get a team?" And I'm like, I thought we were. I don't know.
I mean, I think Portland checks all the boxes from a fan support standpoint. It was awesome turnout for the NCAA tournament this year, the regionals. I was down there for that. And, the Blazers have been willing to kind of work with whoever a WNBA expansion team would be to, use the Moda Center. And, that facility standpoint would be great. So, the only question mark is who's going to own the team? Where is the money coming from? And obviously that's what ended up falling through last fall and why there wasn't an expansion team announcement already made. So I really hope that someone can step up. And, I guess if you're Phil Knight and the group that wants to try to buy the Blazers from Jody Allen, like maybe this is your opportunity. Like, hey, step to the plate and bring a professional team in the WNBA to Portland. And if you can't buy the Blazers, at least show your support in that way.
That's a great idea. I'd be on board with that. Kevin Pelton, give him a follow on Twitter at @KPelton. He's one of our favorites covering the NBA, the WNBA, which is right around the corner for ESPN. Thanks for doing this, man, for hopping on. We appreciate it, the insight on the Blazers, and hopefully we can catch up again with you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.